Hey guys, Keith here. All right, so it's been a while since we've done our last update video, so it's time to bring things up to date. I'm not sure I'm going to get through all of the releases. This video starts at version 2019.10 and we're currently at 2019.18, I think it is. So yeah, there's a fair bit of change that's come out over the last couple of months, and I have been keeping very up to date with getting these videos out. There have been various others putting videos out, some of them reasonably good and complete, some of them a bit speculative, and so I will try and cover things in some detail. I will probably end up breaking this video up into a couple of smaller videos because it may go a little bit longer, and I'll dig into varying degrees of detail in some of these things. So let's start off right back in 2019.10. Here Gil added an option for creating LED Blinky animation files. Thinking back, I believe that's a type of standalone file that you can load. I guess we could Google LED Blinky. So that's right, he was building lights for his games machine, and he wants to run them. LED Blinky is a piece of software that I believe you run on the Raspberry Pi, and it takes a data file and it plays the lights, and he wanted to use xLights to create the LED Blinky data file that it would then run. And so that's up in the Tools Convert menu, where basically he made the output format the LED Blinky, the LWAX files, an interesting file name. He made that as a possible target. I imagine you take an FSCQ file or something, and you select this as the output file format, and you run it. You end up with that file. You copy it up onto your LED Blinky device, and I guess you get nice, colourful lights onto your games machine. I'm sure I've seen Gil post a couple of videos and pictures of that thing in action. Increase the maximum lines read from file for a text effect. This one's pretty straightforward. Let's get out of 3D. Let's throw a matrix down. Let's give it lots of lines. For some time now, you've been able to drop a text effect onto something like a matrix up here, and you know, most people are used to the idea of typing hello up here and having it appear on their matrix, but you can also choose to pull the text out of a file. And what this change does is it increases the number of lines that it will read from that file to 20. So if I was to, let's bring up Notepad. If I was to say, hello world, that'll do. I don't need to show all 20. And if I was to throw that up onto my desktop and call it, I don't know, just hw.text, sounds good. Then I could come back into xLights here and change this, browse here, go to my desktop, find my hw.text file, and it will load the text out of the text file. Now this is really useful if you've got something like, I don't know, a tune-to sign or something like that, and you've got that in every single sequence, and you want to update the text to be, you know, maybe you've got to change radio stations because a new radio station's opened up and taken your frequency, or there's a bit of static on it and you want to change it. Then you can just go back and batch render all your sequences, and they'll pick it up out of that one text file instead of having to go in and open up each and every sequence to update the text in the text effect. So that's why it's there. And we've increased the maximum number of lines to 20. Hopefully that's enough for even some of these bigger P5 matrices and the like that people are using. So that's what that one's all about. Including XMap files in the backup. XMap files are the import files that store the mapping between your models and the models from the sequences that you're importing. Previously, they weren't included in the backup. We back up things like XML files and XBackup files and the like, but we never included the XMap files. And now we do. So they'll be thrown into the backup folder each time it backs up. Typically, most people have that set up on start. Just make sure you don't lose them, or you can go back in time to find an old mapping file. So hopefully that helps. XSchedule API change. As you all would know by now, located in our xLights GitHub repository is all the source code to xLights. Within that, there's an XSchedule folder, and within that, there is a text file here called the API documentation, which describes all of the APIs that you can invoke if you're wanting to programmatically control XSchedule. Well, we've added a new API here, which is a change show folder, and you can specify a show folder name, or you can pass in just a blank, in which case it forces the current show folder to be reloaded, and then obviously the schedules will restart, etc. Now, I don't imagine many people are going to use it, but you could imagine in a system where you're trying to maybe control XSchedule externally by yet another program, it might be kind of nice to be able to force XSchedule to reset itself and reload everything. Maybe you've got another program that's changing another file that it uses or something, and you want to force it to be reloaded. So that API is in there now for those people. If models on a port are not using contiguous channels, put them on virtual strings. We're going to talk about a number of changes to controller uploads that have come out, and this one's quite an important one. So previously, well, let me show you how this kind of works. So if you, let's imagine you've got a bunch of models here. So I'm going to create a star, and I'm going to put it on port 1. Right, and then I'm going to create, I don't know, let's just spinner just so that it's distinct. Right, and I'm going to put this on port 2. Okay, and then I go back and I don't know, let's create yet another star for the hell of it. And we're also going to put this on port 1. And we're going to sort these things up here by start channels. Now notice I haven't played with or set any start channels, I've just taken the default. So now what we've got is we've got this star here, which starts at start channel 7504 and ends on 7653 on port 1. But the next model on the next set of channels is actually on a different port. And then we have another model here, which is also back on port 1. Now, prior to this release that we're talking about, version 10, if you uploaded that to your Falcon controller or any other controller for that matter, it would have loaded, or it would have tried to output channel 7504 through to 7953 out port number 1, which is clearly not right. There's these extra channels in the middle that you don't want to be outputting. And so with this change, the upload to the controller is smart enough to realize that these channels are not contiguous. They're not all in one big block. They're in 2 blocks. So if your controller happens to support virtual strings, it will actually define some virtual strings onto your controller. And so when you upload these models, they will actually upload and work correctly, even though the channels aren't contiguous. Which is kind of neat. It's, yes, we'll get another scenario you don't have to worry about, and it will just deal with it behind the scenes for you. Now that only applies to controllers that support virtual strings. FPP does support virtual strings, although to be honest, I believe Dan, when he uploads to the Falcon Pi player, actually puts every model on its own virtual string. On the Falcon controllers, that's not true. The Falcon controllers have a hard limit of, it's around about 130 virtual strings. And so consuming a virtual string for every single model would be extremely wasteful and potentially get you into trouble. And so when it uploads to something like a Falcon controller, it looks very carefully at your model settings and only creates a virtual string if it feels like it's really necessary in order for it to work. Many other controllers, of course, do not support virtual strings. If you're using a Pixel Stick or a xLight or a PixCon or a SAN devices, they don't support virtual strings. And so in that case, you have to make sure that your channels are contiguous, that you're putting out onto a single port. The all state. Okay, so all right, I'm going to take a bit of a risk. Of course, I should have prepared better for this, and I haven't. So let's quickly go and download a model. He says quickly, and we'll see if Boscoyo has included some of their newer props in here. The decor, yeah, they do. Okay, yes, this is the one I want. The decor toy soldier. Hopefully you've seen this. So we'll insert this model. Now, this model, I believe, hopefully this is true, it does. It has a set of states defined. Now, states are something that the vast majority of users have never, ever touched, never had any reason to touch. The only times that people use it, there's some quirky things with 7-segment displays, which I used to have in my show. There's some people with moving heads that might be using states, or some of the DMX models using states, but this is a new use for the state definition. And basically what it lets you do is it lets you go through and associate with certain pixels inside this custom model a color. So the shirt's going to be red, the sash is going to be white, the buttons are going to be yellow, the pants are going to be blue, and so forth. And then the power of this is, when it comes time to go and sequence this model, I can do a couple of things. One of the things I can do is I can come up here, grab the state effect and drop it down here on the model, and absolutely nothing happens. But if I come into here and I choose the state of all, suddenly all of the parts of the model light up, and they all light up the color that we defined in the state effect. So really powerful. Now, these are actually likely to be pixels. They're not likely to be colored lead. So this is not just sort of representing them in the right color. It will actually drive your pixels plugged into this model, the color that seems appropriate to the model, without you having to go and hardwire them or set each color individually. The other way that you can use this, and I must admit, I didn't pay attention to the name, so I'm going to get this wrong. But with the state effect, of course, you can set a state effect up so that it references a timing track, and then you can put the states up into the timing track. So let's reference the timing track here, and then we will come up to our timing track, and we'll double click. No, we won't. We'll shift double click because I don't set the setting the way I like it. And we'll set his eyes, for instance. No, it wasn't called eyes. Oh, yes, it does. It was called eyes. So here's his eyes lighting up, which is kind of cool. And you can then separate that, and you can put, I think buttons was another one. So I can put buttons. So now his eyes and his buttons are lit up, but nothing else is lit up. You can also change the mode, and so you can say it's iterating. So now it'll do the eyes, then the buttons, and then eyes, and then the buttons, and so forth, based on what's up here in the list. But the change, that's always been there. The change is you can now actually put a star in here. And a star is basically the same as specifying an all, and it will light everything up on the model when that state is set. So kind of powerful for these new models where, sometimes you want to sequence some pixels and you want to have bars or whatever else running on it, but sometimes you just want to light the prop up the colors that are associated with the paint that's on the model. So quite powerful. Okay, moving on. A relatively new developer, someone I've worked with on a couple of fixes in the past, but he's submitted a couple of code fixes. One is E131 prioritization, a feature that's always been in the protocol, but we haven't actually supported in the past. So now when you add an E131, you can come down here and you can set the priority. Now, you need to have a controller that supports E131 priority. In theory, what this allows you to do is to have multiple sources sending E131 data to your controller, and your controller will take the one that arrives with the priority set at the highest level. From memory, it varies between 0 and or maybe it does go to 255, it probably does. And it will take the highest priority one and will show that. And then if it doesn't see the higher priority one for, I think it's about 3 seconds, it will default back to using the next highest priority and start showing that sequence. So it can be a way to offer a fallback service or potentially an interruption type capability in a show. I don't expect to see that often. I suspect the xLight controllers probably support it. I'm almost certain the Falcon controllers don't. It's quite possible that FPP may support it. I'd have to ask Dan, but definitely, I'm pretty sure the xLights do, because it's quite a popular technique in the commercial trade. For time code, slightly outside jitter limit, nudge it back into time. Won't spend a lot of time on this. This is Stephen was doing a bunch of work around some of the synchronization using some of the timecode protocols like MIDI timecode, etc. And we'd been toying with this concept of a jitter limit, which was the amount that a sequence could appear to be out of sync before we start to take actions to try and realign them. And the reason for that is because the synchronization packets don't always arrive in a very clear deterministic time frame. And so sometimes you need to accept that there's going to be a little bit of difference and not try to keep resetting the timing too often. And what he's done here is he's taken, we've got a time interval in which it won't do anything at all. Then we've got a time interval where it will make small adjustments to try and get it back into time. And then once it gets out there, it will take much more drastic moves like jumping to a different place in the song, etc. So hopefully that will deliver a much smoother experience, particularly in more complicated network setups where potentially there's multiple hops and things are getting lost along the way or getting delayed along the way more correctly. Make the row header resizable. I've been waiting to do this for so long, and I got up the gumption to go in and do this. Sounds so simple, but now you can come in here and this thing here is actually resizable. And that has not been resizable forever, but it is now. Bulk edit to the morph swap points button. Oh, what descriptions I write. Okay, so this is the morph, where you might have a couple of them, because you can't do bulk edit if you don't have a couple of them. And if we grab these two, of course it would help if I hadn't selected timing. If I grab these two and I go to the swap start and end points, I can now right click on this and bulk edit. And what that is like, what that's doing is it's like it's clicking on each one of these effects and then clicking on the swap start and end points, and then clicking on the next effect and clicking on the swap start and end points. So it doesn't actually make them all the same. If this one here, which currently obviously is going like that. Let me bring up the effect assist window. Oh, I'm going to make it always on. I'm going to regret it, but I'm going to make it always on. But so if I make that one like that, and clearly I haven't changed the other one, it's still a full sweep. And now I grab them both and I go to the swap start and end points and bulk edit them. Okay, that one swapped around exactly as you would expect. But this one has also swapped around, but notice it didn't change anything. It just swapped them around. So it doesn't go and change any of where the points are. It just swaps the ones and the twos around so that it morphs in a different direction. Allow material files to be left in a subfolder. Okay, so this one relates to the 3D, and many of you have been importing your OBJ files. And in the early days, when people were first getting going with this, there was a lot of issues with people getting their models in, and the OBJ files would come in, but then they wouldn't get all their textures, and it turned out their textures were in a subfolder, and you had to go and move everything from the subfolder down. And then there were issues with spaces in file names and all of that sort of stuff. Well, this and some bug fixes, which I don't normally talk about, we went in and we fixed those things. So you can now leave those material files in a subfolder if that's how your OBJ file is created. And xLights will actually look for the subfolder, which is referenced in the material file, to find the images that it should use. So hopefully that makes it a little bit easier and more obvious what to do. Upgrading the xLight controller upload for the 16 long range, and to be honest, it will come a little bit later. But I've also done some fairly material upgrades to all of the xLight support. So previously, the way in which this is done is I have some controllers. Some of them are donated. This one was donated to me by Stuart. And I'd built an upload to it. Someone also lent me a 4, which I'd also done some work with and built an upload. But in this case, this board's a version 1 board, so it's quite an old board. And this update here was just bringing it into line with all of the other uploads, supporting setting start channels on strands and everything else. So the uploads now support those sorts of things, and this was updating the upload for the xLights to support that. After this, and we'll come to this a little bit later, but I'll cover it now, the guys at Avitech actually sent me a xLight 16 and a xLight 4 and the specifications of the protocol, because they have quite a different way of configuring their protocols to most others. They have this assistant tool which talks to their controllers. It's quite neat because it's got this in sort of this discovery thing where it can go out and it can find it and configure them. But because I'd had to reverse engineer the protocol to try and configure the xLight controllers, I was only able to support the ones that I had, and I only had a version 1. And obviously they've got their Mark II controllers and all of that sort of stuff, which I wasn't supporting. But now that they generously gave me a copy of the protocol and allowed me to implement it, I've now expanded the xLight support to support all of the various controller flavors and versions of firmware, etc. So hopefully you'll get a much better experience if you go to upload to the xLights. So that's that one. Add shift move to the morph effect assist. Okay, so there's a bunch of changes, and it's not just to the morph here, it's also to the buffer panel up here. So prior to this, you could come up here and you could grab a corner and move it, but now you can come in here and you can actually drag it, and it will, obviously when it bumps up against the edge, it stops. So that's kind of neat. You can also hold down the shift key and drag. Actually, no, maybe it's not. Maybe it's, sorry, it's the control key and drag. And when I do that, I can't move it up and down. I can only move it left to right. And I think it must be control shift drag, where I can only go up and down and I can't go left or right anymore. And the same thing applies to these points. So if I just grab them, I can move them. But if I hold the control key down and drag it, again, I can only move it left and right. And if I hold control shift down and grab it, then it would help if I actually grabbed it. Then again, I can't drag it left and right, but I can only drag it up and down. So this is kind of useful if you want to have a number of effects, you're cutting and pasting them, and then you just want to drag each one across. It makes it so much easier to set your morphs up. Now we've done a similar thing up here with the buffer. Obviously you can drag it, but you can also hold the control key down, in which case you can only move it left and right. And now the same applies with the corners. If you hold the control key down, you can no longer move this corner up and down. It's only left and right. And so hopefully that makes it a lot easier for people to set set their corners and not have to fiddle and try and get things in exactly the same place if you grab things the right way. So that's that one. Ooh, we're through 2 releases. All right, let's keep going. Add palettes to the install. What that means is now when you do an install, this is not going to work. Let me run actual xLights. So I'm running a dev build at the moment, which is why it wasn't there. But if I run my proper install of 2018 and I create a sequence, if I come up here to this drop down, there's now all of these default palettes. So historically, there were actually none here at all, but now there's a bunch of default palettes here that you might want to take advantage of. They're located in the xLights install folder. So hopefully that gives you some quick set options that maybe will help you with your sequencing. And I should thank Pixel Pro Displays, who actually shared those palettes with me to include. Rewalk the morph effect assist gestures. So we just went through that one, so we'll skip over that. All right, this is an X schedule, so we'll come back to those in just a second. Make hold color an option in the shape effect. Yeah, these are little tweaks. Of course, I don't think anyone's going to notice. But if you're running the shape effect, I think it's actually the default. If you set multiple colors, if you don't say hold color, oh, that's right. If you have a color curve, so if I define a color curve on one of these, of course I don't have any because let's make it yellow. If you have a color curve, what will happen is everything will go through the colors as it goes along. But if you put hold color, then each circle holds its color at the time it's created and doesn't change. And so you now see that the colors stick for the duration of each shape. But when each shape is generated, it takes the color at that point in time from the color curve. So that's all that's doing. The lines effect, now I know that some of the sequences have gone out there and made a number of videos on the lines effect. Generally, they covered it pretty well. Yes, it's somewhat inspired by the old Mystify screensaver on Windows. I do suggest that you consider using an oversized buffer for the lines effect. It just gives the lines a bit more room to move around in, and so I do think it offers a slightly different experience. Other than that, obviously the number of lines is the number of shapes that are represented, which you can control. Most of these things have value curves, not everything though. The points is obviously the number of points in each shape. So 2 is obviously just lines. 3 is triangles. 4 is, well, quadrilateral. They're not squares, obviously, they're polygons. And every point's moving independently. The thickness is the thickness of those lines, so each line, how thick it is. You'll notice that the algorithm I use is not perfect. It does actually create the odd artifact on the edge of the lines. You'll only notice it on really, really big matrices like this is a 50 by 50, so they start to show up. The speed controls how fast the points move, and the trails, which don't look that great on thick ones, but if you reduce the thickness down and maybe reduce the number of points to 1, you can see that you get a leading line and then it fades away and it leaves a trail behind which fades out as it moves. And you can stop it from fading, so now you just get the lines without the fade. And that's it. Now, look, there's some interesting places where it looks kind of interesting, particularly on a sparse model where, it can light up some semi-random pixels, and it does look kind of spectacular in the Kaleidoscope effect, which we haven't got to yet, but we will. All right. Subfolder selection to the batch render dialogues. This was Scott. Batch render, wonderful tool, particularly in December when you're making those last minute tweaks and everything needs to be batch rendered. So it's up here in the tool menu. And what was it? He added a subfolder selection. Yeah, so up here I think you can say, oh no, actually it's, yeah, you can say which folder underneath that one you want to search. So maybe you've just got your sequences in a sequence folder. You can say just select my sequences folder rather than my import folder, which will limit the number of things which show up in the list and obviously make it faster. When you get things like this, don't forget to try out the right-click menu. There's often a select all, select none, which can sometimes save you some time from having to click it. The other thing is, the keyboard can be your friend as well. Pressing the down arrow and the space key can also get you through the list pretty quickly rather than clicking on each one individually. Something to try. Timing tracks will persist with the collapse flag. So this is most relevant if you've got lyric tracks. So if you've got a lyric track in here, which we can create, we can, well, we could. I'll have to load the dictionary and that takes a while, so let's not do that. But if this was a lyric track, you can actually double click on a lyric track and it will collapse it down to a single line. In this release here, Scott had xLights now remembers the fact that that timing track was collapsed down, and the next time you open the sequence up, it will open it up with it collapsed. Particularly useful for sequences like The Greatest Showman last year that had a huge number of lyric tracks. And for those of us who sequence on a laptop, every time you open the thing up, you spend the next 30 seconds going and closing up all the timing tracks or moving to a view that doesn't have the timing track so you can actually see your models. So yeah, kind of a useful change. Okay, so this one here, this FireworksXY work independently. So this is actually something that we changed a little bit earlier. I think it was in my last video. We talked about the fact that we changed the firework effect so that you could control whereabouts the firework explodes. But you could set a specific location. You could say, I want it to be there, and it will always fire. But if you only set one of them to not, I think it's a -1 actually when it's not set. If you set one of them to -1, it would basically continue to do it randomly. Now you can choose to just set the X location and it will distribute them over the Y location, or you can come down and set the Y location, in which case it'll distribute it along the X axis, but at the same height. So that's all that means. Okay, we've talked about control and control shift constraints on the corners moves on the various panels, so we'll skip over that, and the kaleidoscope effect. Okay, so let's talk about the kaleidoscope effect. So this is one where people did a pretty good job of describing it. It's the only thing that I don't think people explained very well is exactly how it works. It does some pretty interesting things. So first of all, conceptually, what the kaleidoscope is doing is it is taking a shape, in this case a square, centered in the middle of the matrix, of size 5, which means it's going to be 5 pixels by 5 pixels by 5 pixels. It is taking that square and anything that happens to be happens to be occurring inside that square, which is obviously determined by an effect underneath it. So you must have an effect underneath Kaleidoscope. Kaleidoscope on its own is never going to do anything interesting. It's just like warp. You can put warps wherever you like, but if you don't have something underneath them, it's not doing anything interesting. Same with Kaleidoscope. So it takes that square located in the middle and it starts to replicate it. And it replicates it in a very, very specific way, because a kaleidoscope fundamentally is a set of mirrors inside, often a cylinder, and a bunch of things to then reflect and produce pretty patterns with. And so the way the kaleidoscope works is it chooses an edge of the square, and it says everything, so it draws an imaginary line. Let's say it takes the left edge. I can't remember which edge it takes first, but let's imagine it takes the left edge first. It says, okay, so everything to the right of that left-hand edge, in an infinite line going up and down, everything to the right, I'm going to mirror onto the left. Okay, and so it's basically going to take that square and duplicate it to the left. It then moves to the bottom edge of the square, the original square. It draws an imaginary line all the way across, and it takes everything above that line and mirrors it underneath that line. Now, in that case, it's obviously going to duplicate the two squares, the one that was originally there and the one it's already duplicated, and it's going to duplicate them down. And then it will go across to the right-hand side. It will draw an imaginary line again, and now it will copy everything across again. Now, at this point, you know, it's just mirroring and everything's good. It does reach a point where when it does the mirror, it starts to find that there's actually already some pixels that have already been set to a particular color. And at that point, the kaleidoscope does not overwrite the color of those things. So they stay whatever color they were first set during this mirroring process. And it basically continues to do this mirroring in bigger and bigger squares until every pixel on the matrix is set. And at that point, it stops and it moves on to the next frame. So obviously then playing with exactly where the square is or how big the square is will change what an effect looks like. The rotation's interesting as well because the rotation is applied in the mirroring process, and from memory what it does is it rotates the content. No, it rotates the line that it's doing the mirroring with, which is kind of exactly how a kaleidoscope works. When you move a kaleidoscope around, you're turning the mirrors, not necessarily the underlying shapes. And so it produces a rather interesting thing, but the square's still there. The only difference with the triangle is that you now have this 5 by 5 triangle, right, which is actually an equilateral triangle, which again, in this case, is drawn in the center of the shape. And now the triangle is being mirrored. And this produces some very different shapes. Most of the time, to be honest, I'm not enormously happy with it, but it works. It's a little bit less robust in that the triangles don't always guarantee that every pixel will get set, and so sometimes you do get blank pixels as a result of that. But it does produce some rather unusual shapes and colors, and at the end of the day, sometimes that's exactly what you want. So the triangle is in there as another shape. Now, I'm not going to go and show you a whole bunch of different things. There was a video. There's been a number of videos out there which have shown some of the really cool things that you can do with Kaleidoscope, and it's one of those things that I expect to see showing up in a lot of people's megatrees and matrices because of its flexibility. Okay, let's loop back and let's quickly talk about some of these X-schedule things. So the first one, don't think, oh, that's right. So the first one is within a playlist now, there is this checkbox called Always Shuffle. Historically, you've always been able to shuffle playlists, but it's been an attribute that you would have typically set when you scheduled your playlist. So when you come up here and schedule it, you would come in here and say, I want to shuffle this playlist. The Always Shuffle checkbox up here is really designed, and it will override the schedule. So the schedule, if you uncheck the shuffle in the schedule, but you've checked it inside the playlist, it's still going to shuffle because it says always shuffle, which means you can't say, oh, I didn't really mean that. If you don't want it to shuffle always, then don't check this checkbox. But the reason it's there is because if you're going to then use that playlist as a background playlist, and set it up here, if you set the always shuffle, then the background playlist will actually shuffle. And that's the only way to shuffle a background playlist, is to use that attribute inside the playlist. So that's what that one's all about. Now the SMS daemon, I think I'll make a separate video on that. Tom Stallings did put one together. He did a pretty good job with it. He definitely showed it working really well, probably better than I will be able to, because using these SMS services is a little difficult from down here. But I do want to spend a little bit of time talking a little bit more specifically about what the options are and what they do, etc. So I will put another video together on that, but I'll do that separately. Which means I'll talk about these things separately as well, because they're all part of that SMS daemon. Moving on, I realize this is dragging on a little, but let's get it out of the way. I can always cut the video. Check sequence warning if the fireworks is to fire with a timing track, right? So this is just, you know, people occasionally have problems, and this is my fireworks. If you say fire with timing track, but you then don't select a timing track, or it's invalid for some reason, when you run check sequence, it's just going to give you a warning and say, hey, that's not right. That's not going to do anything. So that's all that one is. The circle line spectrogram in VU meter. Okay, well, we need to go and create a musical sequence. Not my favorite thing in the world. So we'll use our most annoying song. Popcorn. You don't get any more annoying than popcorn. Oh, yes, you do. You get Baby Shark, but that's just too annoying. All right. So in the VU meter, in fact, there's a few changes to VU meter that have appeared. There's some additional things up here. So there's now the spectrogram line. It does look a little better if you create it. So yeah, we've had the spectrogram for some time. Which is, you know, the city landscape bouncing up and down. Now there's a line version of it. Obviously, it's exactly the same. It just doesn't include all the things, but it also does give you these extra shadows, which is actually controlled by the sensitivity. If you set the sensitivity right down to 0, all of those shadows will go away, and you just get the line bouncing up and down. It's a slightly different way of effect to look at things. There's also the spectrogram circle line, which is exactly the same concept, except instead of drawing a line across the screen, I'm doing it radially. I think it starts over here and goes around. So these are the low notes here, and the high notes are down here. Similar sort of thing, again with sensitivity. If you add sensitivity, it'll leave the shadows behind. Again, a slightly different effect. You combine that with something like the Kaleidoscope, who knows what you're going to get. Some interesting things. The other one that came in is the frame waveform. The frame waveform, so most of the time we've had things like the waveform itself, right, which looks like the waveform up here at the top of the track. What the frame waveform is doing is it's saying, so this is a 50 millisecond sequence. So this is actually showing the frame within that 50 millisecond sequence. So effectively what it's doing is, let's drill in, let's go all the way in, right? So here's my 50 milliseconds. So it's drawing that waveform in that frame. And then in the next frame, it's going to draw that waveform. And then the next frame, it's going to draw that waveform. And then we're going to get this one and so forth. And so that's what that one's doing, which, you know, it looks more like what some people think an audio, something that's responding to the audio should look like. So again, that's been added. Now there was one other thing, definitely for the spectrogram line, and I think also for the regular spectrogram. I have also added this logarithmic x-axis. Cue boring math stuff, but when you create a spectrogram, what you're doing is a fast Fourier transform on the audio signal. And that's a mathematical transformation. Now, one of the problems with the mathematical transformation, and you can see it here, is down here at the low end, notice how it's really chunky and blocky. But as you get towards the right-hand side here, it's very fine and everything's quite distinct and you know, quite everything's variable. But here on the left-hand side, it never is. And that's a side effect of the algorithm that produces a spectrogram. It just doesn't have the same resolution at the low end. And so by clicking on the logarithmic axis, it actually changes the scale of the waveform, and that means you get a more even distribution of points over the scale is all it does. It's a visual effect. You choose it if you like it, you don't, whatever. So that's that one, and that one, and that one, I think, yes. All right, and that one. Oh God, we're blowing through them. Again, we'll talk about that one. Another one, stop render rate. Okay, so this is, okay. So this is a change in render. Changing the render is always a scary thing to do because you're always worried if it's going to break anything. But no one's noticed so far, so maybe it hasn't broken anything. Previously in xLights, if you had this effect that you've got here and then you had another effect sitting next to it, and you rendered this effect, and it does, every time you click on it, it actually goes back and re-renders the effect. It would actually go all the way back and render this effect as well because they're touching. So I've made a slight change here where it doesn't actually do that automatically. There are still circumstances where it will do it, but in this particular circumstance, it wouldn't. And hopefully that helps it stay a little bit more responsive, keep up to date and seem a little less sluggish. There is a slight risk. And the risk that I'm a little concerned about is if you're using persistent and we're expecting it to grab the last frame of the prior effect, there is a chance that that may not happen. In which case, by all means, let us know and I will go and do something about it. I do have an idea about how I could do that. Or failing that, just click the render all button and it will work perfectly after that, at least until you start touching things again. So that's that one. Screen map area to be maintained. Okay, so screen map is a concept that very few people use, but in this case, I've got one defined. So screen map is a particular type of output. And basically what it lets you do is take an area of the screen and map it to a pixel matrix or a P10 panel or whatever. And it will replicate anything that happens to occur inside this square onto your matrix, which kind of sounds pointless until you think about, well, what if you were to grab your web camera and put your web camera live feed inside this box? Then you can actually take a live feed from a web camera and put it onto your P10 panel or something like that, which is a little bit more interesting. You know, you could take I don't know, you run the basketball scores or something, I don't know. But now all I've changed in this thing is you can now grab and drag this. Previously you had to type numbers in and it was a pain, etc. It will rescale things. So if your TV, your video is this big, but obviously your P10 panel's a lot smaller, etc., it will actually automatically rescale it if you select the rescale over here. So that's kind of neat. You can also click and drag the whole thing as well. So yeah, I don't know how many people use it, but you never know. Fix rendering preview from a 3D camera. Okay, so again, this is a bug, and I don't normally talk about bugs, but this one's another one of those things where things might be a little bit different than how you've expected them to be in the past. So in 3D, and kind of don't necessarily want to spend a great deal of time with this, but let's create a few trees. In many of Gil's demos, he demoed this, but it turned out when I looked at it more carefully, I didn't think we were creating the render buffers correctly, and so some changes have been made. And the place where it becomes relevant is when you right-click here, you save the current viewpoint, call it DDD, and then we go and we create a sequence. Oh, hang on, don't create the sequence. Let's add a group. And let's grab those 3 trees and throw them in there. All right, now let's go and create a sequence. And so I always like the pinwheel when I'm doing things like this. All right, let's make it nice and thick. Let's give it some nice distinct colors. All right, so that's all well and good, but let's go into 3D here. I don't have a mouse with a thing, so it's kind of hard. So this is obviously rendering from the front, and you can tell because when you look at it from the front, it looks like a pinwheel. Now, if we go to our DDD viewpoint, and we'll have to zoom out a bit. Obviously, it looks a little bit funky, but because of the per preview render mode, we can come into here and select that particular render point, and now it looks like it's rendering from this camera perspective. Now, what's changed is that wasn't working quite right, and so I've updated it to, I believe, now work correctly. No one's complained in the last few releases, so it can't be that bad, but it is slightly different to how it was prior to 2019.15. It obviously wasn't different enough, though, that a lot of people started to complain. Anyway, that's what that is. All right, the xLight upload. One of the side effects of the xLight upload is that it also supports the Law Pixicon. It's slightly different controller, but very, 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 very similar. And we've managed to include the support for the Pixicon, or at least the one that I happen to own is now supported for upload. Okay, I do not remember this guy's actual name, but he was a little frustrated. When I built the cube model, I added 184 different ways that you could wire the cube model, and the model settings supported them all. And then he built a cube in one of the remaining ways in which I didn't support. And so he went in and spent the time and did the work to come up with some alternate wiring models. And so if you, in your layout here, if you go and create a cube, got to fix that icon. Someone draw me a nice cube icon so I can replace it. He added some additional settings here, the stacked settings from front to back. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, he added these two stacked front, back, left, right, and that adds, because of the way it multiplies out, that actually adds dozens of new wiring formats where basically you wire the matrix horizontally instead of largely vertically, which were all the ones that we supported prior to that. So that's that change there. Okay, so this one here, so rendering, some screen rendering options to sort through some display issues on model preview. This one relates to some OpenGL rendering issues that we've been experiencing. I believe it's most commonly visible when you have sort of those diffuse floodlight type shapes, etc., where things don't quite render correctly, or as you move around, things start to look a little funky. And so, unfortunately, we tried a number of different settings, but none of the settings really delivered the best outcome in all scenarios. And so, Dan created these 6 render orders here. And so if you're experiencing issues when you're in the layout and as you move around or whatever, things don't quite look right, things seem to be overlaying things incorrectly, etc., you may want to try a different one of these render orders to see whether for your particular layout it helps solve the problem. By default, it's render order 1. I know I get issues on mine. Mine's a laptop. It's got, I think it's an Intel video chip, and I have issues with my OBJ file where my materials come in, but I get these triangular areas where the material doesn't render correctly. And I know it's not my model, because when Gil loaded my model up, because he actually made my model, well, he put the materials on my model. I drew it. He added the materials and exported it for me. And when he does it on his computer, he doesn't get any of the artifacts that I get. So it's a video card issue on my machine. But one of the things that you could try in that circumstance is, again, to play with those render orders. That's what that one's about. And because we couldn't find anything that was perfect in all scenarios, we gave you the option of choosing what made sense to you. The canvas layer selection, select all, etc. What's that mean? Well, that's basically here in the sequencer. If you've got, let's insert multiple layers below, which is all good. You come up here, you select the canvas mode on this effect. Then you've got the layers button here, and it's got multiple layers. Basically, he's added some here, deselect all and select all, etc. Select layers with effects is also another shortcut way of, again, picking the layers that you want to select. I'm not going to explain what this is. If you want to understand what this does, I suggest you go back and look at, I think it was some of the videos around the time that the warp effect came out. And there was another one I did which talked a bit about some of the really cool things that Kevin does. Takes advantages of this ability to individually select layers. And there's another video I made where I showed how you could snapshot the state of an effect and hold it for a period of time. And I took advantage of that ability to select which layers blended together into the canvas mode. So that's what that one's all about. Anyway, okay, so then there's a couple of changes for 3D objects in the layout tab. Basically what Scott's saying is, if you add one of these OBJs, which is objects, which is typically, yes, your house or an image or one of the grids here, he's now added the ability for you to do things like copy and paste these things, which previously you couldn't do. He's also, what's the other one there? Arrow key support. So now you can move them by holding down the arrow keys, which apparently I'd only built for the models, not for all the repeating arrow keys. I hadn't built it for the OBJs. So that's what that one's about. Oh, we're getting close. All right, show the node count in the model tool. Okay, this is kind of interesting because it's funny. Someone complained about this and said, "Oh, it's really hard." And I thought, you know what? I experienced that too. So if you come in here and you build a custom model, I'm gonna get really lazy. Okay, and obviously with 4 nodes like that, it's pretty obvious how many nodes are in it. But if it's actually even better. Let's get out of this 3D objects. In fact, let's get out of 3D entirely. If I click on this guy and I want to know how many nodes are in him, there's actually no easy way to do so other than opening up the model data, hunt around, find the highest number. And so now what we've done is we've added it into the tooltip here. So it tells you that there's 150 nodes in that toy soldier. It's not mapped to a controller, so you miss a whole bunch of stuff. But yeah, it tells me there's 150 nodes in that guy. That's by far the easiest way to get it, other than doing a models export and going and looking in the spreadsheet. Playlist item for outputting a short MIDI message. Again, we're back in xSchedule. We can add an advanced playlist item, and there's now a MIDI one here. You can give it a name. You choose your MIDI device, and then you choose the various MIDI codes that you want to send out. So you can send out a single MIDI event to something else, and obviously you can create many of these. It would get fairly tedious, but you could, and send out MIDI events to maybe trigger some things on something that listen to MIDI events. Obviously, xSchedule can also listen to MIDI events as well, but this is how you can send them out if that's what you want to do. Splitting the timing of marks in. I was watching one of the X Essential videos a few weeks ago, and someone was saying how, you know, it was difficult to do so. I think he was setting his timing up, and he said, now I want to go and create the, of course that's not going to work. He wanted to then go and break these things down. So now if you deselect the timing track, you can come up here, select everything, right click and halve the selected timings, and it will just break them in half. And you can keep doing that as many times as you want. It will keep halving it until it gets to the minimum time interval, and then it will stop halving it. So yeah, so if you've set everything up as bars and you want to break it down into notes and it's 4/4 timing, you obviously just select everything, break it down twice, and now in theory you have all your notes set. The Falcon Smart Remote support. So for those of you that follow the forums reasonably well, Dave has announced that he is working on a new remote which will allow you to basically multi-drop your remotes on a single output port. So your Falcon 48 can now effectively have 48 outputs, and on each output you can have 3 of these smart remotes. Now it doesn't add to the number of pixels, so you start to divide things down into ever decreasing numbers, and so it's probably not a valid way to go and configure an F48, but you could. The challenge is obviously we've spent a bunch of time doing all these uploads, etc., and now you've got this extra concept of this multi-dropped smart remote, and so we needed a way to represent that in xLight so that when you push to the Falcon controller, it appropriately configures things according to which smart remote you're on if you happen to be using them. And so now no one's got any smart remotes yet because they're not out yet. But given that we were doing changes to the protocols, several of the protocols, it made sense to introduce these concepts right now. And so the place where they show up is down here. If I set its output port, I now have this smart remote option, and it can be not applicable, i.e. you're not using a smart remote, and if you're using a dumb remote, it would be NA. But if you are using a smart remote, you can either set it to the A, the B, or the C, and basically that's the order for the controller. So the closest smart remote to the controller is A, the one that's daisy chained off it is B, and then there's a C, and you obviously specify this is on port 4, but you know it's on the first smart controller connected to port 4, and that's how you would describe it. And now when you upload it to the controller, it will configure the Falcon correctly for that once it comes out. Obviously it's a little premature given that none of that stuff's out yet, but it's already built in. It'll work on day 1. All right. Okay, so getting right up onto our last release, we're almost there. xSchedule as an FPP remote now responds to FPP's ping discovery. FPP has always had this ability to go out and find all of its other things when you're setting up remotes. Dan added into xLights or xSchedule the ability to respond to that ping protocol. So now the Falcon Pi players will see any xSchedule remotes. This is a pretty uncommon configuration. There's not a lot of people that run xSchedule as a remote to FPP. But if you do, this will obviously make it easier to identify them on the FPP side. A drop down for selection in force IP address. So for those of you that have multiple network cards, you may have been in a situation where you needed to force local IP address. Well, now instead of typing it in here, it should show you all the IP addresses on your machine, and you can choose the adapter that you want to send your controller data out to, if that's what you need to do. I always recommend people not set that unless they really find that they need to. It just makes doing things a little bit harder. So anyway, but that's that. The law edit file import. Okay, and it gives you all sorts of warnings here. The version in 2019.18 is definitely somewhat limited. This is another one that I'll probably make a separate video on. Effectively, you know, we've obviously supported law importing from S4 for some time now. Late last year, last year, we added the Law Pixel Editor, which brought the effects in and did a reasonable job of getting the effect settings kind of sort of right. It does have a warning when you do it to tell you that, look, it's experimental and contact me if there's any anomalies. Well, yeah, that hasn't happened. The S5 one is basically moving to the next version of Law, S5, where we've started to see a handful of people who have decided to come across to xLights, and we wanted to support their move. And so this is our first cut at an ability to bring the S5 sequences in. It's interesting, they're quite similar to the pixel editor and the LMS files. They're obviously merged together. The LMS data is represented in a somewhat different way. In some ways it's easier to bring in some ways it's harder to bring in. So the results are going to vary a little bit. Not in 2019, but 18, but 19, you'll definitely see that it does a pretty good job on some of the props that I've been testing with. There are a few anomalies though, and it definitely doesn't work spectacularly well in 2019.18. It actually works reasonably well for the pixel effects, not so great for the classic sequencing, but that will get a lot better in 19. Much faster. FPP Connect discovery. So if you go to Tools and FPP Connect, Dan's been making a bunch of tweaks, as you can see here, around that and making that process a lot faster. I'm not sure this is going to work. I've been playing with a few things. Yeah, no, it's not going to find it. So yeah, so I can't really demo that. The ability, okay, I'll come back to that one in a minute. FPP can detect LED panel capes and display the matrix size. Again, I don't have a panel cape set up on my FPP, but what Dan's effectively saying here is, if you have an FPP out there and it has like a BeagleBone cape to drive panels, or a Pi hat to drive panels, when it runs FPP Connect, it will actually determine that you've configured the panels, and it will display the matrix size in FPP Connect for you. And it can also, when you're doing the upload, can update the start channel of any matrices, etc., for those capes. So Dan is progressively tightening the integration here between xLights and FPP, because, like for all controllers, one of the key areas that we see people continually struggle with, no matter how experienced they are, is getting all of their controllers and xLights and everything 100% in sync so that everything works. It's the most frustrating time of the year. It's stressful for Dan, it's stressful for me, because everyone wants to get their show working, they can't get it working, and anything that we can do that reduces the amount of friction there is a good thing in our mind. I'll come back to that in a minute. Discover button on the setup tab. So yeah, this is new. Something we've been working on, or I've been working on for a while, is the ability to go out there and discover controllers. I've been working with this on a slightly separate branch, but Dan started to bring it into the main branch, mainly associated with the Falcon Pi player and the DDP protocol. For those of you using the Falcon Pi player as a controller where you're pushing data to it, the DDP protocol is massively more efficient than E131. E131, for every 512 bytes of data that's sent across, there's this 126 byte header, of which maybe 5 bytes are useful being sent out with that data. And that's in a frame that could have been 1500 bytes, but it was only 630 bytes or whatever it is. DDP is massively more efficient. Its header is only 10 bytes. Of those 10 bytes, again, about 5 of them are really useful, but much less wastage. And then it will use the rest of the Ethernet frame, so 1400 bytes or 1440 40 bytes or whatever it is of data go out in each packet. So the number of packets that are sent over your network goes down dramatically, the amount of data in those packets goes up dramatically, and the amount of wasted crap that's going across your network disappears. And so if you're using FPP as a controller, and you ask Dan, what protocol should you be using? The answer will always be DDP. Now, the one disadvantage to something like DDP, and this is something that's going to change a little bit, is that when you reserve DDP, you just get this block of channels, and so managing all your channels within that block can be a little bit tricky if you're not knowing what you're doing. But that's the thing that we're working on improving. So let's do that, right? Let's go and add a DDP. I don't actually have. Oh, I might have. So you can go in there and here you can define 50,000 channels and it will be fine. It breaks it down into packets of 1440 and you should leave it at that. Now, putting a controller description in, this is going to start to become really, really important, right? Let's say this is my FPP 2.x controller. And now Dan's added this controller type thing here. So you can come in here and say, well, actually, these are LED panels. That's the type of controller it is. And click OK. Now, actually, I'm going to change that. Let's not make it that. Let's make it. There's a pi hat. There's a pi hat. All right. Okay, so pi hat, when I was over here and I set these outputs, that was okay. I set these to be output 1 and output 2, which is fine. Oh, this is on 4. Well, we don't want to do that. Let's get that off. I think I have to set it to 0, don't I? All right. All right. So now what I can do in here, having set the pi hat, now one of the beauties of setting the pi hat is if I come up here and I go right click and I say upload to controller, output definition, pick pi caps and hats. Oh, it didn't. I was expecting it to limit it to just the pi hat. I could have sworn in his release notes he said that's what it would do. No, I need to work on that. The other thing that you can do in here is you can click this visualize button. And what the visualize button, and this is early days, this is going to change over time, but it shows you the 2 ports that were defined. There was a port 1 and a port 2, and it shows you each of the models. Now, because the Falcon Pi player creates a virtual string for each model, they will get listed out like this. So if I added another model, it would appear as another row here. On controllers which allow, sorry, in controllers like the Falcon controller, once this stuff starts to become available for it, it will actually show them going out to the right here, unless they're on a separate virtual string, in which case it becomes a second line like this. And it will also color code these smart remotes as well. That's also coming. So this is the way for you to go and visualize exactly how that data or how those models have been mapped onto those controller ports using this visualize button. And so you may start to see that appear in other areas, but there's a couple, unfortunately, due to a lot of the legacy, etc. It's going to be harder to do on things like E131 and the like, unless maybe you're using one of the one output where you merge all your E131 onto one output. We might be able to make visualize make sense there or something like that. I don't know. We'll work on that. So there's a couple of changes there to DDP. There's changes to visualize. There's a discover button that you could press, which will go out there and find and bring your controller instances. So when you click the discover button, it'll actually create your controllers up here. See, this is the one where it says the upload menu only shows it. I think that's not quite right. And that's about it. Oh, yes, the controller description. So let's quickly save that, do that. So one of the other things that you can do here, for our first model here, where's the first model? a matrix. Okay. All right. So in single line. Where's single line? Oh, there it is. So this one here. Oh, just sort of scroll down. There it is. There is a new way of defining start channels in here, which is on the controller. So you just come in here and you say, and it'll let you choose the controller description and start channel 1 on that controller. So the first start channel on this controller. And that shows up here as an apostrophe followed by the controller name, followed by the colon and the 1. So yet another way of specifying start channels. If you were going to do this, you would do this for the first model on the controller, and then you'd chain everything else. That is by far the most sensible thing to do with something like DDP. There is no reason for you to be getting in there and mucking around and trying to organize individual start channels. Just simple chain it. First model starts on start channel 1 on the controller. Everything else is chained together. Do the upload to the controller and let it take care of configuring the controller correctly to understand the data in whatever layout it happens to be. All right, I think I got it all. So I realize this is a long video. I may well cut it down before I upload it into a couple of pieces. I hope that gave you a good oversight. There's a couple of things here I promised I'd come back to. I will go back and make a video on the whole SMS piece. Yeah, again, I probably won't run a whole bunch of examples, but I will show what it looks like and explain what all the settings are. So yeah, thanks guys. Enjoy, and hopefully we'll have some exciting new stuff coming out soon.